Just because there's no action in the NBA tonight doesn't mean it wasn't a busy weekend. The NBA play-in tournament is tomorrow. The NBA Hall of Fame inductions were over the weekend. So much going on. And to get to it all, joining us right now on the Boardwalk Huddle Hotline, Ben Golliver, Washington Post national NBA writer, author of the new book, Bubble Ball. Great book. You want to get your hands on it. I mean, remember, this time last year, there was no NBA basketball. It all ended up being in the bubble. And this year, we're back to some sort of closer to normalcy. And Ben, as all guests, joins us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Ben, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well. I got to say, I'm really excited about this upcoming week of play-in basketball, and then, of course, the playoffs as well. This was a tough season, lots of interruptions, health delays, all that kind of stuff. But, the basketball is about to count, and I'm really stoked.
So before we get to the basketball that counts, I wanted to ask you about the weekend that was, not just with the basketball, but first of all, I want to ask you, because you wrote about it at the Washington Post, about the Basketball Hall of Fame inductions, and it really felt like, I know a lot of people were focusing on Kobe and Vanessa Bryant and everything that happened, but one thing that stood out to me was it felt like there was just a special level of just reverence for arguably what might be the greatest class in any sport to ever enter a Hall of Fame, and because of just the sheer volume of the people who were going in. And it was just an amazing weekend of just absorbing the kind of people that were up there accepting that honor.
Yeah, I would say for sure it was a very solemn weekend because of the Kobe Bryant factor. There's no way around it. It was also kind of surreal because instead of doing it at the Hall of Fame, they did it at this casino, Mohegan Sun, up in Connecticut. And so, you had a lot of people going around gambling, drinking, have a good time. And then, meanwhile, there's all these, famous basketball luminaries walking by with, ball gowns and tuxedos and everything. So it's kind of a surreal experience that way. But, of course, it was an incredible class. 3 great NBA headliners between Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, and Kevin Garnett. And I thought all 3 speeches were really memorable. Tim Duncan getting up there and saying, hey, look, this is as nervous as I've ever been, more nervous than a Game 7. I thought that was peak Tim Duncan. He never loved to talk to the media, never loved to talk about himself. But I thought he did a nice job explaining his basketball origin story and how he found his way to the sport from swimming. Of course, Kevin Garnett was just, so juiced all weekend. I mean, just kind of bouncing up and down like a little kid during the press conference. And, it was smart of them to have him go first because he helped set the tone and get everybody into the mood. And, of course, he was shouting out the Celtics and their fan base and his roots in Chicago and South Carolina. But then, of course, the whole thing built up to Vanessa Bryant. I mean, she's almost as clutch as her husband, if not as clutch. I think that this is an unbelievable pressure-packed moment. You've got Michael Jordan walking you to the stage, a lot of expectations, Kobe's fans chanting his name in the building, and she just knocked it out of the park again with her speech. And, kind of flipping the idea on its head, instead of saying, here's who Kobe would thank, I want to thank Kobe, and going through all the different ways that he impacted her life. I thought it was very moving. It was something I'll never forget.
Yeah, the other thing for me is that, watching those guys go up there, and I think people forget sometimes how good some of these players are. And this is not a diss on anybody in particular, but in the NFL, we have NFL films, right? In baseball, we have Ken Burns baseball. So many times people don't understand the history of the game, even what happened just 20 years ago. So I feel like these moments where you have these induction ceremonies and these reflections are just so important to remind people about the history of the game and these great people who came before.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big student of the game, or at least I like to consider myself one. And, watching these guys who just combined for countless All-NBA, all-defensive selections, Duncan 5 rings, Kobe 5 rings, Garnett a ring. And, kind of every single year Garnett was talking about this. Look, if you wanted to win the title, you had to go through either Kobe or Duncan, and just some legendary battles between the Spurs and the Lakers over the years, too. I mean, there was so much basketball history to it. And that's before you even get to the rest of the class. I mean, Tamika Catchings had a great speech. You go right down the list of some of the, very celebrated coaches who got in. And Rudy Tomjanovich, I think he sometimes does get overlooked by history, being that coach of the Rockets teams that won the titles in between Jordan's three-peats. I think that sometimes they get short shrift historically. And, of course, Hakeem Olajuwon, just one of the greatest centers of all time, to be there in person to pay respects to Rudy T. It was fascinating. But, it goes back a little bit to the Kobe factor. It was a little bit of a memorial, to be honest, as well. I mean, you had guys like Magic and Bill Russell showing up early and hugging each other and just letting those hugs last for like a couple seconds longer. The idea that there was one of their own who wasn't able to be up there, and the idea of wanting to cherish that time together, that really struck me, just taking the ceremony in person.
Ben Golliver joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, he is the author of the new book, Bubble Ball, Inside the NBA's Fight to Save a Season. And Ben, the first time we had the play-in tournament, it was in the bubble, as you write about in your book. And now it's not in a bubble. It starts tomorrow night. People can hear all the action right here on 97.3 ESPN. And I'm excited. I know some people are detractors of this concept, but I think that this play-in tournament made the last couple of weeks of the NBA season way more intriguing and way more of a fascinating reality play playing out.
Well, I think the detractors have kind of gone by the wayside, haven't they? At least mostly. I think there's been a lot of momentum building around the idea. You look at just the payoff, LeBron versus Steph. I mean, what more do you really want? I think that's pretty much the ideal matchup from a TV rating standpoint, from a hype standpoint on Wednesday night. And even this Boston versus Washington matchup is really interesting, too. I mean, Boston's kind of limping in. The Jaylen Brown injury is, really going to hold them back, I think, in terms of their playoff goals. And you've got Washington with all this momentum, I think 17-6 over their last 23, if I'm not mistaken, trying to, pull the upset after a really, really tough early start to their season. So, to me, you've got fascinating matchups in both play-ins, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then that's before we even really get into the good stuff. So, to me, it's a validated idea. I expect it to be back next year. I think that it did succeed in generating the interest that you described, as well as getting some marquee names into the actual games themselves. Look, the NBA has been hurting from a financial standpoint, billions of lost revenue during the pandemic. To me, anything that's going to build up excitement and buzz, that's going to be something they're trying to keep.
Also, you mentioned Washington. Like, we have a chance to see some incredible matchups because of this play-in tournament. Like, under the normal circumstances, Washington's not in, but now we could potentially have Russell Westbrook versus Kevin Durant, James Harden, and then Mike D'Antoni just hiding on the bench over there. We could have, in the postseason, you could have LeBron versus any variety of people in there, variable situations. So to me, the play-in, the potential matchups, it's so exciting to just kind of play around with the idea of the what ifs for these different scenarios.
Oh, for sure. I mean, look, we could be getting LeBron versus Chris Paul in the first round, Lakers Suns 2-7. I mean, that would be an awesome personality matchup as well, especially right after LeBron versus Steph. I mean, just some really fun, just personality rivalries. And again, you're talking about the Hall of Fame earlier. I mean, all those guys are going to be first ballot Hall of Famers. So those are games for history as well. It's so funny because if you're Boston, let me ask you this: if you're Boston, would you tank this game against the Wizards and try to take your shot in the second play-in game against either, Charlotte or Indiana so that you didn't have to face the Nets? Like, if you're Boston, would you rather play Philly in the 1-8 or would you rather play Brooklyn in the 2-7? I think if I'm Boston, I would rather play Philly personally. I mean, you had success against them in the past. You don't want to have to deal with KD and Harden and Kyrie without Jaylen Brown. So if I was Boston, I'd actually think maybe let Washington win that one on Tuesday night. They probably won't be that risky because, you get into some pretty leveraged territory there where it's like, well, if you slip up, then you're just out and you miss the playoffs entirely. But I think most teams would prefer to play Philly than Brooklyn, don't you think?
I would say this is my only concern for Boston, and that is I don't know if they don't win that game against Washington and they got to face Indiana. I feel like Indiana is a horrible matchup for them because who on earth is slowing down Sabonis? So to me, it's kind of like a catch-22 where it's like, yeah, if you let Washington through, you can maybe get the 8 seed, but then you're risking the possibility of dealing with the Pacers on the other end.
No, that's what I mean. It's tricky choices. And, we see teams dump games like at the end of the regular season to manipulate the matchups, like the Clippers did that the last couple of games here. That's pretty common cause. Denver did that the other night against Portland. But when you're in the play-ins, do you really have the guts to do that? I don't know. I guess it comes down to how afraid of the Nets are you? And we'll probably see a good game in that Boston-Washington matchup. It's funny, though. Everybody's been talking about the Wizards so much. I almost feel like it takes some of the pressure off the Celtics I think that they've been so shaky and up and down this year. It's easy to write them off. Again, Washington closing so strong with Westbrook getting the triple-double record and Beal almost being the scoring champion. They've been getting a lot of buzz, so it's almost like a role reversal. I wonder if that could actually play to Boston's favor a little bit. People may be overlooking them just slightly.
Ben Golliver joining us here on Game Day on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN at Ben Golliver on Twitter, Washington Post NBA writer. The new book is out, Bubble Ball, Inside the NBA's Fight to Save a Season. Last year we had the play-in games in the bubble. This year they're not in the bubble. And that's the other side I want to ask you, Ben. How do you think that having fans at these games could affect this stuff? Because, for example, in Philadelphia, I think they've lost a total of, 11 games at home in the last 2 years? To me, I have to wonder, I'm looking at these games, could the home crowds in Indiana or Boston or LA impact any of these games?
Well, for sure. It's going to be variable because not every arena is able to have the same number of fans, right? So you're going to have louder crowds in some places than others. But if you look at the best teams in both conferences, they actually have better records at home than on the road this year. So even though it's been a tricky year, again, a lot of empty arenas, there has been a demonstrated home court advantage this season, especially among the best teams. And I think that can sometimes be psychological. It can just be comfort factor, sleeping in your own bed, all that kind of stuff. Hearing your own player introductions and getting hyped up, that's better than being at a neutral court. So I do think home court matters more than most people might expect this season, even if there's fewer crowds in the building. Especially think about it for like Philly versus Brooklyn or Philly versus Milwaukee, or even Milwaukee, Brooklyn, if we get that in the second round. I mean, home court will matter there because those series are tight. Those are all good basketball teams that have championship aspirations, and every little edge helps. And so I do think it was very important for the Sixers competitively to get that number one seed because it gives them an easier path through the playoffs, and it also gives them, or to the finals, I should say, and it also gives them home court, throughout the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, let's touch on that a little bit more, Ben, because the Sixers are going to allow 50% capacity for the first couple rounds of the playoffs in Philadelphia. So you're talking about an arena that only had maybe a couple thousand in there, now having a little over 10,000 people potentially in there for these games. And you have to think for the Sixers, for a team that comes into that building, no matter who they are, even if it is a team like the Nets, those Philly fans can get a little ridiculous. And you talk about this pandemic has everybody, trying to break free of their cage to say, these fans might be a little even more crazy than usual because this is the first playoff game they've seen in 2 years.
Well, I'm telling you what, I took my first trip here in months, and, there was a lot of people at the airport who were pretty excited to be out and about, right? So, I mean, if that's just a typical airport environment where people are just, feeling like it's almost a party, I can only imagine what the playoff atmosphere is like. And look, 10,000 fans is no joke. You can make a lot of noise with 10,000 fans in one of those NBA buildings, and that's a lot different than the bubble. I mean, keep in mind, that was like 200-300 people in the entire building, and most of them were instructed not to cheer, not to clap, or to really make any noise whatsoever. So it's going to feel much more normal. Probably not all the way normal, but much more normal this year compared to last year. And I think for teams, again, the higher seeded teams, they're going to be using that to their advantage. That's the one trick for the Lakers. I think that they actually have a pretty clean path through the Western Conference. They match up really well with just about everybody else in that bracket on their side before they would have to face maybe the Clippers in the conference finals. But they're going to have to do a lot of their work on the road.
You opened the door for my very next question, Ben. I wanted to ask you, between the Lakers and the Nets, whose superstars do you have more faith in their availability on a night-to-night basis?
Well, flip a coin on that one because all those guys have missed so much time. I think for the Lakers, though, their margin of error is thinner, right? Like they have to have LeBron at like 90+% or it's just not going to happen. They need Anthony Davis playing at an A or an A+ level or it's not going to happen. We saw their offense just fall to pieces without those guys here over the last couple of months. And everyone they're going to play is going to be a good offense, from Golden State to Phoenix to potentially Utah, the Clippers, whoever it's going to be. I mean, it's nothing but really good offenses. And that's before you get to the finals when you could face Brooklyn's got a historic offense. So to me, the Lakers are probably on shakier. And I've really enjoyed watching Brooklyn put the pieces together here over the last week or so. I think that they've closed strong. They showed what they needed to do from Harden, and ultimately that's what they wanted to see. I mean, when you're going back a couple of weeks and he's out and you're nervous, is our season going to go kaput? I think they saw plenty to give them a lot of confidence here heading into the postseason, and they should have a pretty easy first-round matchup, no matter who they draw.
I'm still sticking by my big curiosity also with the Western Conference, and that is, you mentioned LeBron and AD have to be at a certain level of ability, and I keep wondering, will they ever be at that ability? Because even LeBron was saying, I won't be 100% again this year, and I just have to wonder, any version of the Lakers that's less than what you described, I mean, do they even get out of, let's say, maybe the first round? Because it's not like the teams that you mentioned, they play the Suns, and the Suns are at 100%, and LeBron's maybe only like 75%. I just don't see how the Lakers can get out of there. So there's a possibility in my eyes that the Lakers, they're a betting favorite, a lot of books, to potentially not just win the Western Conference, but win the NBA title. I don't even know if they're going to get there, Ben.
Well, it's completely fair, concerns and doubts. LeBron has looked pretty good here the last week or so in terms of when he has played. So I think that's a positive sign if you're the Lakers fan. They also just match up really well with Phoenix. I mean, a lot of inexperienced pieces for Phoenix. It's going to be a slow down, half court type of series. And, that makes it easier on LeBron's body. And I think they execute very well offensively. The Lakers do at full strength. So they should be in good shape there. Like if you have to take a control possession series and your choice is LeBron or Chris Paul, as great as Chris Paul is, I think you're generally going to side with LeBron. But it's all about the chemistry and the continuity, right? I mean, the best teams in the West, Denver, Phoenix, Utah, have just been rolling and playing very smooth, team-oriented basketball because they've had a lot of shared reps together. And, they've just been clicking on all cylinders here for the last couple of months. That has not been the case for the Lakers. This has to be a flip-a-switch type situation for L.A. Otherwise, they're going home early like you're predicting.
Ben, I want to jump back over to the East, ask you about this. It looks like, now that we're locked in, so the Sixers are 1, Nets are 2, Bucks are 3. But one could argue that, for the first 2 rounds for the Nets and the Bucks, they may get so beat up before they get to the conference finals. Is it legitimate to say that the Sixers could actually be the favorite in the Eastern Conference, considering that their road to get there is certainly looking a little easier than what the Nets and the Bucks have to put up with?
Yeah, I'd rather go on a tough road with Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Kyrie Irving than on an easy road with the Sixers' big three. That's me personally, but I totally get the point that you're making, especially because Milwaukee, I mean, they might have to go 7 with Miami, 7 with Brooklyn, and then what does that look like in the Eastern Conference Finals, right? I mean, for Philly, it's not going to be a complete cakewalk in the first round, but we can expect both their first and second round series to be much, much easier, relatively speaking, than what Brooklyn and Milwaukee are going through. I just think there's a chance that we see, some of those highlight level plays like we saw from the Nets here the other night with the behind the back pass, off the alley-oop, off the backboard alley-oop, and you're going to see plays like that and think, oh, wow, Brooklyn's talent is here to play. And I just think they're better and deeper than anybody else in that conference. So it really just comes down to health for me. I mean, regardless of what their path looks like, I could easily see them sweeping Boston in the first round if that's what it comes to, 2-7. And at that point, they'd be nice and fresh and ready to go for Milwaukee. So I think you're overstating it slightly. Philly's in the mix, but to me, I would still put Brooklyn above them on their own tier.
He's Ben Golliver, NBA writer for the Washington Post. A brand new book. You can get it wherever books are sold. It is called Bubble Ball: Inside the NBA's Fight to Save a Season. This documents everything that happened in 2020 from before the bubble, in the bubble, and the aftermath of it. And, of course, Ben, tell the folks about your other project, the Greatest of All Talk podcast.
Oh, greatestofalltalk.com. Subscribe there. We're talking twice a week. We're going to have play-in previews this week, playoff previews, of course, and, all sorts of coverage from events like the Hall of Fame. Whenever I go out there on the road, try to give a behind-the-scenes look at that as well.
Again, at Ben Golliver, also on Twitter for all your NBA coverage. As all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Ben, appreciate the time as always.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. Take care.